Ever wondered what Edwardian women really did with their hair when they weren't posing for portraits? It wasn't always about towering, impossible updos. We're pulling back the curtain on the unseen daily routines and evolving fashion trends that shaped Edwardian hairstyles, uncovering the surprising diversity and practicalities that defined an era often misjudged by its most famous looks. Hello, I'm Dame of Legends, and tonight we're delving into the fascinating world of Edwardian hairstyles. A world far more complex and varied than the history books would have you believe. So sit back, relax, and feel your eyes drift off to sleep as we begin our journey through the strands of time. When we think of Edwardian hairstyles, one image dominates our collective imagination: the Gibson girl. Created by illustrator Charles Dana Gibson in the 1890s and reaching peak popularity in the Edwardian era, she became the defining beauty standard of her time. But let's take a moment to truly understand what she represented, and more importantly, what she obscured. The Gibson girl wasn't just a hairstyle, she was a cultural phenomenon. Picture her: soft waves piled high on the head, creating volume and height, with gentle tendrils framing the face. Her hair was swept up in a pompadour style at the front, building upward and backward in luxurious waves. The back was typically gathered into a loose, full bun or chignon, positioned relatively high on the head. The overall effect was one of abundant, natural-looking volume, though achieving this natural look required considerable effort and artifice. But why did this particular style capture the imagination of an entire generation? The Gibson girl's hair was a social statement, a declaration of ideals. It represented the new woman of the turn of the century, educated, athletic, independent in spirit, yet still feminine and fashionable. Her hair suggested both refinement and a certain casual confidence. It was elaborate enough to show she had the time and resources to maintain it, yet not so rigid that it suggested she was trapped by convention. Charles Dana Gibson's illustrations appeared in publications like Life magazine and Collier's Weekly, reaching millions of readers. Young women studied these images like instruction manuals, attempting to recreate the artful waves and voluminous styles. Hairdressers found themselves inundated with requests to achieve the Gibson girl look. It became shorthand for Edwardian beauty, femininity, and modernity all at once. The Gibson girl's hair also reflected deeper social currents. The Edwardian era, spanning roughly from 1901 to 1910, was a time of significant social change, particularly for women. The suffrage movement was gaining momentum. Women were entering the workforce in greater numbers, and traditional gender roles were being questioned. The Gibson girl embodied this tension. She was modern and independent, yet still firmly within the bounds of respectable femininity. Her hair, voluminous yet controlled, mirrored this careful balance. So how did we arrive at such a narrow understanding of Edwardian hairstyles? The answer lies in the nature of historical documentation and the biases inherent in what gets preserved and remembered. First, consider what survives from this era: formal photographs and portraits. In the Edwardian period, photography was still a relatively formal affair. People didn't casually snap photos of their daily lives. Instead, they visited photography studios for special occasions: weddings, anniversaries, professional portraits. For these formal sittings, women naturally wore their most elaborate hairstyles. These were not everyday looks. They were aspirational, ceremonial, meant to showcase status and beauty. Similarly, the fashion illustrations and society pages of newspapers and magazines focused on the elite, the wealthy women who could afford to spend hours having their hair styled, who attended balls and garden parties where such elaborate coiffures were appropriate. The Edwardian era's media, like all media, had a narrow lens. It focused on what was sensational, beautiful, and aspirational. A countess's towering pompadour at a royal garden party made for compelling content. A factory worker's practical bun did not. This creates what historians call preservation bias. We have abundant documentation of how wealthy women styled their hair for formal occasions, but very little of how ordinary women styled their hair for everyday life. It's like trying to understand contemporary fashion by only looking at red carpet photos and high fashion magazines. You'd miss the reality of how most people actually dress day to day. Additionally, the very elaborate styles were more likely to be remarked upon in diaries, letters, and memoirs. When something was unusual or impressive, people wrote about it. The everyday, mundane styling choices went unremarked and unrecorded. Over time, this created a skewed historical record where the exceptional became viewed as typical. The early 20th century also saw the rise of hairdressing as a specialized profession and industry. Trade publications and instructional manuals focused on complex, time-consuming styles because these showcased skill and justified the expense of professional services. Simple, practical styles didn't warrant detailed instructions or elaborate illustrations. So tonight, we're correcting the record. We're going beyond the narrow frame of formal photography and society pages to explore the full spectrum of Edwardian hairstyles. We'll discover that Edwardian women's relationship with their hair was far more nuanced, practical, and varied than the iconic images suggest. We'll explore how a lady's maid might style her own hair versus her mistress's. We'll examine the practical braids and buns worn by working women, the transitional styles worn during the day versus evening, the regional variations, and the gradual evolution of fashion throughout the decade. We'll look at hair care practices, the tools and techniques used, and how factors like occupation, social class, and personal circumstance shaped daily hair choices. The Edwardian era was a time of extraordinary change, technological, social, and cultural. Hairstyles, like all aspects of fashion and daily life, reflected and responded to these changes. By understanding the full diversity of Edwardian hair, we gain insight into the lived experiences of women during this pivotal period in history. So let's move beyond the myth of the monolithic Edwardian updo and discover the rich, varied reality that existed beneath those Gibson Girl waves. In the Edwardian era, hair wasn't just hair. It was a language, a form of communication that could be read and understood by anyone who knew the code. The way a woman wore her hair announced her social class, her occupation, her marital status, even her moral character, all without her saying a word. Let's explore how strands of hair carried such significant social weight. Imagine you're walking down a London street in 1905. You pass a variety of women, and even at a distance you can read their social status by observing their hair. That woman with the towering pompadour, adorned with jeweled combs and perfectly coiffed waves? Clearly a member of the upper classes. The young woman with her hair pulled back in a simple tight bun covered by a cap? Likely a housemaid or factory worker. For domestic servants, and remember, domestic service was one of the largest employment sectors for women in Edwardian England. Hair needed to be practical above all else. A scullery maid working in the hot, steamy environment of a kitchen couldn't afford loose tendrils or elaborate styles that would become disheveled during work. Her hair was typically braided or twisted into a tight bun at the nape of the neck, often covered with a cap or kerchief to keep it clean and out of the way. The type and quality of hair covering also signaled status within the servant hierarchy. A simple cotton cap indicated a lower-ranking servant like a scullery maid or kitchen maid. A more refined cap with lace trim might belong to a housemaid. A lady's maid, the highest-ranking female servant who attended directly to the mistress, might wear a more decorative cap or even go capless when not performing particularly dirty tasks, as she was expected to maintain a more polished appearance. Interestingly, when servants had their rare time off, their hairstyles often changed dramatically. Photographs from servants' days out show young women with their hair styled in approximations of fashionable styles, modest pompadours, soft waves, decorative combs. They were, in these moments, claiming a different identity, temporarily stepping outside the rigid boundaries of their working roles. For working-class women in factories, shops, and trades, practicality remained paramount, but there was more room for individual expression than for domestic servants. A shop girl who interacted with customers needed to look neat and respectable, but also somewhat fashionable. Her appearance was part of her job. Her hair might be swept back from her face and twisted into a moderately full bun, perhaps with a few soft waves around the face. Nothing too elaborate, but enough to signal that she was a respectable young woman aware of current fashions. Middle-class women occupied an interesting position. They had more leisure time than working-class women, but unlike the wealthy, they often couldn't afford ladies' maids to spend hours dressing their hair. Middle-class women became skilled at creating fashionable styles themselves, or with the help of family members. Their styles might follow current trends, but would be slightly simplified. A pompadour without quite as much height, fewer decorative elements, styles that could be created in 30 minutes rather than 2 hours. For upper-class women, hair was an art form and a full-time occupation for themselves and their servants. A wealthy woman might spend 2 hours or more having her hair dressed for an important evening event. The complexity and height of styles, the quality and quantity of hairpieces and decorations, the sheer amount of time that could be devoted to hair, all of these announced privilege and leisure. The difference between practical and ceremonial hairstyles varied dramatically across social classes, but one truth held universally. Most women had multiple hairstyles they cycled through depending on the day's activities. Consider a middle-class married woman. Let's call her Mrs. Thompson. On a typical Tuesday morning, Mrs. Thompson would style her hair in what was called a home coiffure, presentable but not elaborate. Her hair might be brushed smooth, twisted into a simple figure-8 bun at the nape of her neck, with perhaps a gentle wave or pompadour at the front. This was appropriate for receiving tradespeople, supervising servants, if she had any, and general household management. If Mrs. Thompson planned to go out shopping or make social calls in the afternoon, she might add a decorative comb to her bun, adjust the pompadour to be slightly more pronounced, and ensure her style was neat and fashionable. This required perhaps an additional 15 minutes of preparation. For evening entertainment, dinner with friends, a concert, or a dance, Mrs. Thompson's hairstyle would transform. She might incorporate hairpieces to add volume, create elaborate waves and curls, add decorative combs or even a small tiara if the occasion was formal enough. This transformation might take an hour or more, possibly with the assistance of her daughter or a hired hairdresser. This pattern of graduated formality existed across all social classes, just with different baselines. A factory worker's dressed-up style might be another woman's everyday look. A duchess's casual morning style might be more elaborate than a middle-class woman's ball attire. The concept of appropriate styling was crucial. Wearing hair that was too elaborate for one's station or circumstances was considered vulgar and pretentious. Conversely, not taking sufficient care with one's hair, even for practical activities, could signal moral laxity or social deterioration. Hair was a tightrope walk of social signaling. If hair itself was a social language, hair accessories were exclamation points and subtle footnotes. They could whisper or shout a woman's wealth, taste, and social position. Let's start with the most basic: hairpins. Every woman used hairpins, but the quality varied enormously. A working-class woman might use simple wire hairpins, functional and cheap. A middle-class woman might have tortoiseshell or bone hairpins, more expensive, more attractive, but still primarily functional. A wealthy woman might use hairpins made of precious metals, possibly jeweled, that were both functional and decorative. Combs were where social distinctions became more pronounced. Decorative combs ranged from simple carved bone or celluloid designs that a shopgirl might save up for, to elaborate creations of tortoiseshell, silver, or gold, often encrusted with precious stones, pearls, or enamel work. The famous Art Nouveau combs of this period, featuring flowing natural designs, were available in versions for every budget, but the quality and materials varied dramatically. Tiaras and hair ornaments represented the pinnacle of decorative hair jewelry. These were almost exclusively the province of the wealthy. A true tiara, with diamonds or other precious stones set in gold or platinum, was a significant investment. Upper-class women might own several, wearing different pieces for different levels of formality and different social contexts, but the Edwardian era also saw the rise of costume jewelry and imitation pieces. This democratization of fashion meant that women of more modest means could approximate the looks of their social betters using paste jewels, gilt metal, and clever imitations. This caused some anxiety among the elite. If everyone could look fashionable, how could true social distinctions be maintained? The answer lay in subtle details of quality, authenticity, and overall presentation that could be read by those in the know. Ribbons, flowers, and feathers represented another category of hair decoration. Fresh flowers were a particular favorite for evening wear. Roses, violets, orange blossoms for brides. The use of fresh rather than artificial flowers signaled both wealth — fresh flowers were expensive and had to be replaced — and good taste. However, high-quality artificial flowers were also widely available, and wearing them was not considered shameful for those who couldn't afford fresh blooms. The language of hair accessories was complex and constantly evolving. What was fashionable one season might be passé the next. This rapid change served to maintain social boundaries. Those with the leisure, money, and social connections to stay current could be distinguished from those who were perpetually a season or two behind. Interestingly, the movement towards simpler, more artistic dress advocated by dress reformers also influenced hair accessories. Some progressive women began favoring simpler ornaments, or even eschewing obvious decoration in favor of letting the hair itself be the focal point. This was both an aesthetic choice and a subtle political statement, a rejection of excessive ornamentation and traditional feminine display. Hair accessories in the Edwardian era were never just decorative. They were markers of identity, signals of wealth and status, and tools for navigating a complex social world where one's appearance was constantly being read and judged. Fashion, as we know, never stands still, and the Edwardian era was no exception. Though we often think of it as a single aesthetic moment, the Gibson girl, the S-bend corset, the picture hat, the reality is that fashion evolved significantly throughout the decade. Hair, as an integral part of the fashionable silhouette, evolved right along with it. Let's trace this evolution and understand the forces that shaped it. To understand Edwardian hairstyles, we must first understand the Edwardian silhouette. The dominant shape of the early 1900s was the so-called S-bend, or health corset, which pushed the bust forward and the hips back, creating an S-curve profile. This was considered more natural and healthier than the wasp-waisted Victorian corset, though in reality it simply redistributed pressure and strain rather than eliminating it. This distinctive silhouette had profound implications for hair. The forward thrust of the upper body created a visual imbalance that had to be corrected. The solution? Voluminous hair piled high on the head. This upward emphasis counterbalanced the forward lean of the torso, creating a harmonious overall silhouette. Think of it as a visual equation. If the torso extends forward, the hair must extend upward. The more pronounced the S-bend, the more voluminous the hair needed to be to maintain proper proportions. This is why we see such dramatic height in early Edwardian hairstyles, with pompadours that seem to defy gravity and buns positioned high on the crown of the head. The creation of this volume required several techniques. First, women often used rats, pads made of wire mesh, horsehair, or sometimes even a woman's own shed hair collected from her hairbrush and formed into pads. These rats were positioned under the hair to create the foundation for volume. Hair would be swept over and around these pads, then pinned securely in place. Women with fine or thin hair particularly relied on such aids. Natural hair alone often couldn't achieve the volume required by fashion. Hair pieces were also common: false fronts for the pompadour, switches, lengths of hair on a clip to add fullness to buns and chignons, even full transformations, essentially wigs, for those who could afford them or whose own hair was particularly sparse. The weight of all this hair, both natural and added, was considerable. Women complained of headaches and neck strain from supporting such elaborate structures. Hairpins by the dozens were required to keep everything in place. Some styles used small combs positioned strategically within the hair to distribute weight and provide additional support. Interestingly, this emphasis on hair volume paralleled broader cultural anxieties about female power and presence. As women became more vocal in demanding political and social rights, their physical presence also expanded. They literally took up more space, with their voluminous skirts, their broad-brimmed hats, their towering hair. Whether this was deliberate symbolism or unconscious expression, it's a fascinating correlation. As the Edwardian era progressed, we see a gradual but distinct softening of styles. The rigid pompadours of 1902 become the softer, more flowing waves of 1908. The precise, structured buns give way to looser arrangements. What drove these changes? several factors were at play. First, there's the natural cycle of fashion. What was fresh and exciting becomes familiar, then tired, then passé. The reaction against the extreme formality and structure of early Edwardian styles was perhaps inevitable. By the mid to late 1900s, younger women in particular were seeking something less rigid, more natural, more expressive of individuality. Second, there were practical considerations. The time and effort required to create and maintain the elaborate styles of the early 1900s was simply unsustainable for many women, even those with leisure and means. As women became more active, bicycling, playing tennis, engaging in other sports, they needed hair that could withstand movement without immediate collapse. Third, there was an emerging aesthetic movement that valued simplicity, natural beauty, and rejection of excessive artifice. This was connected to broader movements like arts and crafts, Art Nouveau, and later the emerging modern movement. Influential tastemakers began advocating for simpler, more honest beauty that worked with a woman's natural features, rather than attempting to mold them into a standardized ideal. By 1908 to 1910, we see the emergence of what would become the defining aesthetic of the 1910s. Softer, lower styles with an emphasis on natural texture and movement. The pompadour becomes less pronounced, a gentle wave rather than a structured architecture. Buns migrate from the crown of the head to a lower position at the nape of the neck. The overall effect is still polished and feminine, but noticeably more relaxed. This transition is beautifully documented in fashion magazines and ladies' journals of the period. Early in the decade, illustrations show hair as a major focal point, elaborately detailed and prominently featured. By the end of the decade, while hair remains important, the emphasis has shifted. Illustrations show more variety in styles, more casual arrangements, more acknowledgement that not every woman could or would want to achieve the most extreme versions of fashion. The rise of the artistic or aesthetic style also influenced mainstream fashion. Women associated with artistic and intellectual circles often wore their hair in deliberately unconventional ways, looser, wavier, sometimes even worn down or in loose plaits. While these styles remained outside the mainstream for most of the Edwardian era, they represented an alternative vision that would gain ground in the following decades. The concept of the new woman was central to the Edwardian era's social and cultural conversations. This term described educated, independent-minded women who were challenging traditional gender roles, demanding the vote, pursuing careers, seeking greater personal freedom. While the term had originated in the 1890s, the Edwardian era saw these ideas gain broader traction and social acceptance. Hair played an interesting role in these debates. On one hand, the elaborate hairstyles of the period seemed to contradict independence. They required time, money, and often assistance to maintain. They seemed to reinforce traditional femininity and women's decorative role. Suffragists were sometimes criticized for their appearance, with opponents suggesting that women who neglected their hair and dress were unwomanly and undeserving of political rights. Yet there were subtle ways that hair reflected changing ideas about womanhood. The Gibson girl herself, with her confident bearing and active lifestyle, represented a middle ground, fashionably feminine, yet clearly capable and independent. Her hair was elaborate, but not overly so, suggesting she had both the refinement and the practicality to navigate modern life. Some progressive women deliberately simplified their hair as a statement. They might wear it in plainer styles, use fewer decorations, favor artistic rather than conventional arrangements. This wasn't abandoning femininity, but redefining it on their own terms. These choices were rarely dramatic enough to invite scandal, but they signaled a different set of priorities and values. Working women who by necessity maintained more practical hairstyles also contributed to changing norms. As more middle-class women entered the workforce, as teachers, nurses, secretaries, shop assistants, they brought their more practical styling habit with them. What began as necessity gradually influenced fashion, as the distinction between work and social hairstyles became less rigid. The gradual simplification of styles through the Edwardian decade can thus be read not just as an aesthetic shift, but as reflecting deeper social changes. As women gained more independence and autonomy, as their lives became more active and varied, their hair evolved to match. The towering pompadours that required hours of maintenance gave way to styles that could withstand a day of activity, that could be managed without constant assistance, that allowed women to move through the world with confidence. By the end of the Edwardian era, in 1910, we're on the cusp of even more dramatic changes. The 1910s would see a continued simplification, and by the 1920s, the complete revolution of bobbed hair. But these later changes were made possible by the gradual evolution of the Edwardian period, as women slowly renegotiated their relationship with fashion, femininity, and self-presentation. The Edwardian era's hair fashions thus represent a fascinating moment of transition. Rooted in Victorian tradition, but moving steadily toward modern simplicity, reflecting both the persistence of old values and the emergence of new ones. Now let's pull back the curtain entirely and examine the practical reality of Edwardian hair care and styling. We'll discover that beneath the elegant final result lay a world of specialized tools, time-consuming techniques, and surprisingly sophisticated hair care practices. We'll also find that for every elaborate evening coiffure, there were numerous simpler, practical styles that women wore for everyday life. Creating an elaborate Edwardian hairstyle was genuinely labor-intensive. Let's walk through what it actually involved, step by step, to create a typical formal updo of around 1905. First, the hair would need to be clean. We'll discuss hair washing shortly, but for now, know that hair was typically washed less frequently than today, perhaps once a week or every 10 days, using soft soap or specially formulated hair washes. Between washings, hair was brushed vigorously, often with natural bristle brushes that distributed the scalp's oils through the length of the hair, keeping it conditioned and glossy. The styling process began with brushing and sectioning. Hair was divided into zones: front, sides, back, crown, each of which would be styled separately before being integrated into the final composition. For a pompadour, the front section was crucial. This hair would be thoroughly brushed, then back-combed, teased at the roots to create texture and volume. Ratting combs with their fine, closely spaced teeth were essential tools for this. Next came the padding. A rat or pad would be positioned where volume was desired, typically just behind the hairline for a pompadour, or at the crown for height. The teased hair would be smoothed over this pad, creating the illusion that all that volume was natural hair. This required skill. The surface needed to look smooth and polished while concealing the padding underneath. Pins were inserted at angles to secure the hair to the pad without being visible. The sides of the hair were typically waved. Before electric curling irons, which didn't become common until later, this was achieved using heated metal tongs. These tongs, which looked like giant scissors with cylindrical blades, were heated in a gas flame or over a spirit lamp. The temperature had to be carefully judged. Too hot, and the hair would be singed or burned. Not hot enough, and the wave wouldn't set properly. Experienced hairdressers could test the temperature by holding the tongs near their cheek, or by waving them near a piece of tissue paper. The tongs were used to create waves by clamping sections of hair and holding for several seconds. The hair was then wrapped around the tongs in an S shape to create the characteristic Marcel wave, named after French hairdresser Marcel Gratteau, who pioneered the technique in the 1870s. Creating even symmetrical waves on both sides of the head required considerable skill. Women who couldn't achieve this themselves, most women, would visit a hairdresser or have it done by a skilled family member or servant. Once the front and sides were styled, attention turned to the back. The nape and crown hair would be gathered, possibly with additional hair pieces added for fullness, and arranged into a bun or chignon. This might be a simple twisted coil, or something more elaborate, a figure-8 bun, a braided structure, a Psyche knot, a loose, artful arrangement popular in the early 1900s. Again, padding might be used inside the bun to create more fullness. The hair would be wrapped around a donut-shaped pad, or a smaller rat would be hidden within the arrangement. Everything was secured with hairpins. Long, sturdy pins for the structural work, shorter pins for securing the surface. A typical formal style might use anywhere from 30 to 60 hairpins. Finally came the decorative elements: combs, ribbons, flowers, jeweled pins. These weren't just ornamental. They also served a functional purpose, providing additional support and helping to conceal pins or imperfections in the styling. The entire process for an experienced stylist working on a formal evening style might take 1.5 to 2 hours. For a woman doing her own hair in a simpler style, perhaps 30 to 45 minutes. This time, investment was simply accepted as part of life, the cost of achieving the feminine ideal. What did women wear when they weren't attempting elaborate formal styles? The answer varies by social class and occupation, but there were several common practical options. The simple bun was perhaps the most universal style. Hair was brushed smooth, gathered at the nape or mid-level on the back of the head, twisted into a coil, and pinned securely. This could be achieved in 10 to 15 minutes and was appropriate for housework, casual activities, or professional settings like offices and schools. Variations included the figure-8 bun, where the hair was divided into 2 sections, each twisted and wrapped to form a number 8 shape, and the rolled bun, where the hair was rolled upward from the nape and pinned in place. Braids were another practical option, particularly for younger women, working women, and in less formal settings. A single braid down the back was common for girls and young unmarried women in casual settings. For adults, braids were typically coiled and pinned rather than worn loose. The coronet braid, where one or more braids were wrapped around the head, was a particularly attractive practical style that remained neat throughout the day. For women with very long hair, the catigan or club, where the hair was gathered at the nape, twisted, then folded back on itself and secured, provided a secure, professional look that showed off hair length. while keeping it completely contained. Working women developed their own practical variations. Factory workers might wear their hair in a low bun completely covered by a kerchief or snood. Nurses typically wore very simple, tight buns that could be completely concealed under their caps. Shop girls might have a modest pompadour with a simple bun, fashionable enough for customer-facing work but not so elaborate as to be impractical. The interesting thing is that many of these practical styles could be dressed up with relatively minor additions. A simple bun could become more formal with the addition of a decorative comb or a few Marcel waves framing the face. The same basic structure could thus serve for both day and evening, with modifications. Women's magazines and ladies' journals of the period regularly featured sections on quick, practical hairstyles alongside the more elaborate designs. Titles like 5-minute coiffures for busy women or practical styles for the working girl acknowledged that most women needed options that balanced fashion with practicality. The Edwardian era saw increasing emphasis on hygiene and health, including hair health. While some practices seem unusual to us today, there was genuine scientific thinking behind many of them, and a real dedication to maintaining hair in good condition. Hair washing, as mentioned, was less frequent than modern practice, typically once a week to once every 2 weeks for most women. There were several reasons for this. First, the water quality and heating systems of the time made frequent hair washing challenging. Hauling and heating water for a full hair wash was labor-intensive. Second, the soaps and shampoos available were often harsh, and frequent use could damage hair. Third, there was a belief that too frequent washing stripped hair of its natural oils, leaving it dry and brittle. When hair was washed, the process was elaborate. For those who could afford it, specialized hair washes and shampoos were used. These might be based on Castile soap, egg, or various herbal preparations. Instructions from the period suggest a thorough process. Hair was wetted, soap or shampoo applied and worked into a lather, rinsed multiple times to ensure no residue remained, then often treated with a final rinse of vinegar water or lemon juice to restore shine and manageability. After washing, hair was towel dried, then dried naturally or by sitting before a fire. Hair dryers existed by the late Edwardian period, large hood-style dryers used in salons, but these were not common in homes. For most women, hair drying was a lengthy process, which is another reason frequent washing was impractical. Between washings, hair care consisted primarily of brushing. This was not a cursory activity, but a ritualized practice. Women were advised to brush their hair 100 strokes per day. Some recommendations suggested morning and evening sessions of 50 strokes each. This brushing served multiple purposes. It removed dust and debris, distributed natural oils from the scalp along the hair shaft, stimulated scalp circulation, and kept hair smooth and tangle-free. The type of brush mattered. Natural boar bristle brushes were considered ideal, as they were gentle on hair and effective at distributing oils. Cheaper alternative brushes with mixed bristles or plant fibers were available for those who couldn't afford pure boar bristle. The bristles should be neither too stiff, which could damage hair, nor too soft, which wouldn't be effective. Hair tonics and treatments were widely used. These ranged from simple preparations like witch hazel or bay rum to more complex compounds containing various botanicals, oils, and even mild medications. Many were designed to promote hair growth, prevent hair loss, add shine, or address specific problems like dandruff or an oily scalp. The effectiveness of these varied widely, but their widespread use demonstrates a culture that took hair care seriously. For hair problems, women consulted numerous sources. Ladies' magazines regularly featured advice columns addressing hair concerns. Pharmacists compounded special preparations. Some even consulted doctors for persistent problems, though this was expensive and typically reserved for serious issues. Interestingly, there was also a thriving industry of dubious miracle cures and treatments. Advertisements promised to grow hair on bald heads, turn gray hair to black, make thin hair thick. Some of these products were harmless if ineffective. Others contained potentially dangerous ingredients. The desire for beautiful hair and the social pressure to maintain it made this a profitable market for both legitimate and questionable products. Diet and health were also recognized as important for hair condition. Articles from the period advised that good nutrition, fresh air, exercise, and adequate sleep all contributed to healthy hair. This holistic view of beauty and health was ahead of its time in some ways, though the specific dietary advice often reflected the nutritional understanding of the era. For those experiencing hair loss or thinning, a significant concern, particularly for older women, transformations, wigs, and hairpieces were openly advertised and widely used. There was no shame in supplementing one's natural hair. It was seen as sensible maintenance of appearance. High-quality hairpieces, made from human hair and carefully matched to the wearer's color and texture, were expensive, but considered a worthwhile investment. The overall picture is one of a culture that valued beautiful hair and was willing to invest significant time, effort, and resources in maintaining it. Hair care was not vanity, but an essential part of respectability and self-presentation. The specific methods may differ from our modern practices, but the underlying commitment to hair health and appearance is something we can certainly relate to. As we approach the end of our journey through Edwardian hairstyles, let's turn our attention to the present day. How has this era, now more than a century past, continued to influence contemporary fashion and culture? Why are these styles experiencing a renaissance? And what can we learn from looking at Edwardian hair with fresh, informed eyes? If you pay attention to fashion and beauty trends, you've likely noticed Edwardian influences in recent years. These appear both in high fashion contexts, runway shows, editorial photo shoots, and in everyday style choices that may not even be consciously referencing the era. The romantic updo remains a perennial favorite for formal occasions. Weddings, in particular, often feature hairstyles that echo Edwardian aesthetics. Soft waves pinned loosely at the nape, hair gathered high with artful tendrils framing the face, volume at the crown, balanced by softness at the sides. These styles evoke the same romantic femininity as their Edwardian predecessors. The revival of vintage and vintage-inspired fashion has brought Edwardian elements into contemporary style. Designers like Zimmermann, Batsheva, and others who specialize in romantic feminine designs often pair their clothes with hairstyles that reference the early 1900s. Fashion shoots in magazines like Vogue and Harper's Bazaar periodically feature models in Edwardian-inspired hair, introducing these looks to new generations. Interestingly, specific elements of Edwardian styling have been adopted and modernized. The pompadour, for instance, has been reinterpreted in various ways. From the voluminous, blow-dried styles of the 1980s to contemporary undercut pompadours that combine vintage height with modern edge. The Gibson girl's signature waves and volume have been recreated using modern tools and techniques, appearing in everything from Pinterest tutorials to professional salon services. Hair accessories have also seen an Edwardian revival. Decorative combs, jeweled hairpins, and hair ribbons, all staples of Edwardian styling, have returned to fashion. Contemporary designers create both faithful reproductions of period pieces and modern interpretations that capture the spirit of Edwardian ornamentation while fitting current aesthetics. The natural hair movement and the trend toward embracing textured curly hair have an interesting parallel with Edwardian ideals. While the Edwardian era certainly used artifice and styling aids, there was also an appreciation for abundant, naturally textured hair. The Marcel wave worked with hair's natural tendency to wave. The voluminous styles celebrated fullness and body. This appreciation for hair's natural qualities resonates with contemporary values. Beyond fashion and beauty, there's been a broader cultural interest in historical hairstyles, including those of the Edwardian era. This manifests in several ways. Historical costuming, whether for theater, film, historical reenactment, or personal enjoyment, has become increasingly popular and increasingly concerned with authenticity. Communities of historical costumers share techniques, tutorials, and resources for recreating period hairstyles. YouTube channels, Instagram accounts, and blogs dedicated to historical hair have emerged, offering detailed instructions for achieving authentic looks. Film and television have played a significant role in popularizing Edwardian aesthetics. Shows like Downton Abbey, which ran from 2010 to 2015 and remains popular, introduced millions of viewers to Edwardian style, including hairstyles. The show's historical costume designers researched period styles extensively, creating looks that were both historically accurate and cinematically beautiful. This sparked a surge of interest in Edwardian fashion generally, and hair specifically. The rise of social media has democratized the sharing of historical styling knowledge. What was once accessible only through specialized books or expensive workshops is now available to anyone with an internet connection. This has created a community of people passionate about historical hair, experimenting with techniques, sharing results, and supporting each other's efforts. There's also been scholarly interest in the social history of hair, with academics examining how hairstyles reflected and shaped social structures, gender norms, and cultural values. Books, articles, and even museum exhibitions have explored the meaning and significance of historical hairstyles, including those of the Edwardian era. Why this resurgence of interest now? Several factors seem to be at play. There's a general nostalgia for perceived simpler times, though as we've seen, the Edwardian era was anything but simple. There's an appreciation for the craftsmanship and artistry involved in creating historical styles, a desire to connect with pre-digital handmade beauty. There's also perhaps a reaction against contemporary fashion's sometimes casual aesthetic, a desire for formality, elegance, and occasion in how we present ourselves. As we conclude our exploration, what can we take away from this deep dive into Edwardian hairstyles? First, we've learned that the reality was far more complex and varied than the iconic images suggest. Edwardian women's relationship with their hair encompassed art and craft, fashion and function, personal expression, and social conformity. They were navigating multiple, sometimes competing demands: the desire to be fashionable, the need to be practical, the requirement to signal appropriate social standing, the wish to express individual personality. Second, we've seen how deeply intertwined hair was with social structures and cultural values. Hair wasn't separate from the social changes of the era. The rise of the new woman, the suffrage movement, changing class relations, but intimately connected to them. By examining hair, we gain insight into the lived experiences and daily negotiations of women during this transformative period. Third, we've been reminded of the artistry and skill involved in creating these styles. It's easy to look at historical photographs and see only the final result, forgetting the hours of work, the specialized knowledge, the physical tools and techniques required. Understanding the process gives us a new appreciation for what was achieved. Fourth, we've recognized the surprising continuities between past and present. While specific styles have changed, many of the underlying concerns remain the same. The desire to look attractive, the need to balance fashion with practicality, the use of appearance to communicate identity and values. We're not as different from our Edwardian predecessors as we might think. Finally, we've learned the importance of looking beyond stereotypes and simple narratives. The story of Edwardian hairstyles is not women wore elaborate updos. It's a rich, nuanced tale of fashion and function, continuity and change, constraint and creativity. By digging deeper, we discover a more authentic, more interesting history. The Edwardian era was a time of extraordinary change: technological, social, political, cultural. Women were navigating new opportunities and persistent constraints, trying to define what it meant to be a modern woman while still operating within traditional structures. Their hair, in all its variety and complexity, reflects this negotiation. It was both an anchor to tradition and a means of signaling change, both a source of pleasure and a burden of expectation. Today, as we look back at Edwardian hairstyles, we can appreciate them on multiple levels: as historical artifacts that teach us about the past, as aesthetic inspirations for contemporary style, as reminders of the artistry and skill of previous generations, and as windows into the experiences of women whose world was different from ours, yet whose concerns and aspirations we can still recognize and relate to. The towering pompadours, the intricate waves, the elaborate buns, these were more than just hairstyles. They were statements of identity, markers of social position, works of art, daily practices, sources of pride and frustration, traditions and innovations. They were, in short, deeply human, which is perhaps why they continue to fascinate us more than a century later. And so we've reached the end of our journey through the fascinating world of Edwardian hairstyles. We've moved far beyond the iconic Gibson girl to discover a rich landscape of practical buns, professional waves, artistic arrangements, and everyday styles that rarely appear in history books, but were just as much a part of the era. We've seen how hair served as a social language, communicating class, status, and values without words. We've traced the evolution of fashion through the decade, watching styles gradually soften and simplify in response to changing aesthetics and social conditions. We've pulled back the curtain on the tools, techniques, and time required to create these looks, and we've discovered the sophisticated hair care practices that supported them. Most importantly, we've learned to look at Edwardian hairstyles with nuance and appreciation, seeing beyond stereotypes to recognize the full spectrum of styles, purposes, and meanings that existed during this remarkable period. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the strands of history. This is Dame of Legends, reminding you that behind every historical image lies a richer, more complex story waiting to be discovered. Until next time, sweet dreams.